So the reason I wanted to make this video is because separation of church and state has become a hot topic in society. And I wanted to go over the history and what is happening currently and pretty much to show the importance of this. Now, it's important to note that while most of the founding fathers of America never said the specific words separation of church and state, they did very much believe in it. It was a foundational principle that religion was to play no part in civil government. And I'd like to go over several quotes from the founding fathers which attest to this fact. Thomas Jefferson said, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." So Jefferson actually said separation of church and state, and while the Constitution doesn't say that, he actually applied what the Constitution does say and says that, well, that's exactly what it means, separation between church and state. Madison said, "The religion, then, of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. It is the duty of every man to render the Creator such homage, and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This right is in its nature an inalienable right." He also said, "We maintain, therefore, that in matters of religion, no man's right is abridged by the constitution of civil society, and that religion is wholly exempt from its cognizance." George Washington said, "Every man conducting himself as a good citizen and being accountable to God alone for his religious opinions ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience." Adams said, "It is the duty of the clergy to accommodate their courses to the times, and to warn against the encroachments of civil power." He also said that the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. Hold on a second. I'm not seeing the clergy warning against the encroachments of civil power. In fact, right now I'm seeing the opposite. The clergy in America want to join with the government, and in many ways already have. Knowing that our nation was never meant to be a Christian nation to begin with, I want to look back at history and see what the joining of church and state looks like, because we're actually seeing a lot of rhetoric saying that American is a Christian country. So in Babylon, the king was chosen, or he was seen as chosen rather, by the gods. Worshipping these gods was mandated, and refusal was seen as rebellion against the state. Enforcement of religion can be seen in Daniel 3:4-6, where coercement of citizens to bow down to the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar set up takes place. And the subsequent persecution that followed can be seen clearly in the same chapter, when the Jews that did not bow down got thrown into the fiery furnace. Josephus says that Nebuchadnezzar made them servile and transplanted them into Babylon, where they lived in bondage with no small miseries. I think that we can all agree that Babylon was not the ideal government and was very oppressive, so I'll move on. Pagan Rome also had the belief that the emperor was chosen by the gods. While worshipping these gods was not always mandated, introducing new religions was absolutely banned, especially religions that said that there was only one God to be worshipped, because the Caesar was seen as a god and was seen to be worshipped by the people. And this led to Christians being heavily persecuted. They were crucified, boiled alive, fed to wild animals in the Colosseum, dipped in tar and used as human torches for the games at the Colosseum, and a ton of other really, really, really bad things that I don't want to get into. Eusebius, who is known as a Christian historian, said that the royal edicts were published everywhere, commanding that the churches be leveled to the ground and scriptures destroyed by fire, and that those who held offices be degraded if they continued to confess Christ, and that those in households, if they persisted, be deprived of their liberty. Again, I think we can all agree that pagan Rome was very oppressive towards people that held different religious beliefs, so I'll move on. In papal Rome, the Pope was accepted as chosen by God. Those who did not hold this as true, among other doctrines, were deemed heretics and persecuted. Now, the word heretic is actually pretty interesting. It goes back to the Greek origins, and the original word means to decide and act upon what one believes for oneself, or, in other words, freedom of conscience. Those heretics were burnt at the stake, pushed off cliffs, and had their children dashed against the stones, imprisoned, tortured, excommunicated, which meant total alienation from society, beheaded, drowned, and all kinds of other horrid things. The history of Protestantism is telling in itself. At the Fourth Lateran Council, it says, secular authorities shall be induced and compelled, if necessary, to exterminate all heretics. If rulers neglect to purge their lands of heretical depravity, they shall be excommunicated. So here is clearly seeing the church enforcing the extermination of heretics through secular power, or in other words, combination of church and state. Pope Innocent III said, we excommunicate and anathematize every heresy, and command that secular powers shall be enforced to exterminate all heretics. So again, secular powers enforcing the extermination of heretics as seen by the church. And Summa Theologiae says, with regard to heretics, the church does not immediately condemn them, but after first and second admonition, if they remain obstinate, the church, no longer hoping for their conversion, delivers them to secular tribunal to be exterminated from the world by death. I'm not saying that Catholics as individuals are this way at all, but I am pointing out that when church and state combine, persecution soon follows, and this is an example that happened in the medieval ages. The Church of England is really similar. The king was seen as the supreme head of the Church of England. This led to those who held different beliefs being imprisoned, having their rights stripped, being fined and killed. The Act of Uniformity in 1559 says that every person shall diligently and faithfully resort to their parish church upon every Sunday and holy day, and abide orderly and soberly during the time of common prayer. And if any person shall willingly abstain, he shall forfeit 12 pence for every such offense. In the American colonies, they were a bit different because they didn't have a single head that was seen as above everything or chosen by God or the gods. However, they still tried to have church and state combined, which resulted in punishment, as seen from the following quotes. The laws and liberties of Massachusetts say that all persons not diligently frequenting public worship of God in the Lord's day shall pay 5 shillings for every such neglect. In Massachusetts General Court, it said, every Quaker found within this jurisdiction shall be banished, and upon return shall suffer death. The Code of Laws in Connecticut said, every person shall diligently frequent and attend the public worship, and whoever shall unnecessarily absent himself shall forfeit 5 shillings for every such offense. In Laws Divine, Moral, and Martial, it says, every man and woman shall repair in the morning to the divine service, and upon pain of losing their day's allowance for the first offense and whipping for the second. Now, why am I going over all of this? Because I wanted to show that it does not matter the background that a person is from. If church and state combine, persecution follows. We looked at paganism in Babylon and Rome, Catholicism in Papal Rome, Anglicanism in the Church of England, and Protestantism in the colonies of America, besides Maryland. And these have vastly different backgrounds, but all have one thing in common, and that is that the church used secular civil authority to enforce its mandates. Why must this take place every single time church and state combines? Because civil authority seeks to change behavior, and religion seeks to change the mind. I would be very happy as a Bible-believing Christian if every single person on earth converted to Bible-believing Christianity. However, to enforce that is not only wrong, but it's impossible because it deals with the mind and what a person believes. And when the church starts using a secular authority to force people to change their minds, persecution is the inevitable result. Finally, my last example is America after the Constitution in the late 1800s. And you may have thought that the combination of church and state was only a thing before the Constitution, which outright bans it as seen before. However, in the late 1800s, laws were proposed that banned work on Sunday. And the result was that those that believed in another day of rest were persecuted. A county court record says, for performing labor on the first day of the week, called Sunday, the defendant is hereby sentenced to hard labor on the county road for 20 days. The law regarding the observance of Sunday is binding upon all citizens, whether they regard that day or another as the Sabbath. In the state of Tennessee, Seventh-day Adventists have been convicted, imprisoned, and set to work in the chain gang with criminals because they could not conscientiously observe Sunday. We were in prison with thieves and murderers and compelled to the most degrading labor for no other crime than that of quiet Sunday labor after having kept the Sabbath of the Lord. The Seventh-day Adventists have been arrested and convicted for plowing and hoeing corn on Sunday, the law being rigidly enforced. And the last quote is, "The civil law ought to enforce the observance of Sunday as a day of rest. The state should maintain the authority of the church." Now that's a significant statement. The state should maintain the authority of the church. So history shows time and time again that whenever a civil government tries to institute religious laws, persecution happens. And whenever a religious entity joins hands with civil authority, persecution happens. It does not matter which way it happens. But the point is that when church and state are combined, either way, every single time an oppressive regime emerges. Why is this relevant? I believe that we are seeing history repeat itself in America, possibly for the last time. And as evidence, there are some evangelicals and Christian nationalists who claim Trump was appointed by God. Remember how the Caesar was claimed to be appointed by the gods, so was Nebuchadnezzar, so was the Pope, whenever you have, and so was the King of England for the Church of England. So that's a pretty significant statement. The sitting president is selling a Bible that has civil American documents in it. That is quite literally the combination of religion with civil authority and history. The Department of Labor is posting images of churches and alluding to Sunday as the day of rest on their Facebook page. Christian nationalism as a whole is gaining footing in society. A faith office was set up in the White House, and that is composed of Christian nationalists. The sitting president had a Catholic mass conducted at his residence, and the president and vice president of the United States openly stated that the separation of church and state may not be so good and was never something our founding fathers wanted, which we know to be untrue based on all of the quotes that I supplied at the beginning of this video. As evidence for all of these claims that I've just made, here's some of the quotes from prominent political figures in our modern society. Donald Trump, talking to Christian nationalists, said, "They say separation between church and state. I said, all right, let's forget about that for one time. I don't know, is that a good thing or a bad thing? But whether there's separation or not, you guys are in the White House where you should be." J.D. Vance said, "You are all looking forward to greeting Christ seated in heaven. Attend to him lying under the arches. Attend to him hungry. Attend to him shivering with cold. Attend to him needy. Attend to him a foreigner." Now, the problem is that this sounds good. I mean, who doesn't want to attend to the needy, the hungry, the one shivering and cold, the foreigner? Who doesn't want that? That is a good society. That is a moral society. The problem is that this is coming from the Vice President of the United States, who is giving a speech in front of a large audience. He also said, you do not have to completely kick God out of the public square, which is what we've done in modern America. It's not what the Founding Fathers wanted. Lauren Boebert said, "The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. I am tired of this separation of church and state junk that is not in the Constitution." What is so ironic about this quote is that she says the government is not supposed to direct the church. But if the church directs the government, inevitably some churches will be directed by the government. Take as an example Islamic countries. Islam directs the government in those countries, and as a result, the government directs Christian churches that they cannot exist in the most extreme cases. It is the same with any government that is directed by any church, is that the churches that disagree with the governmental church will inevitably be persecuted and will be directed by the government. And finally, Charlie Kirk said, "A separation of church and state is a fabrication. One of the reasons we're living through a constitutional crisis is that we no longer have a Christian nation, but we have a Christian form of government." I'm not trying to attack any individuals here. My point is that separation of church and state itself is beginning to dissolve on a societal level. And if this continues to happen, it will inevitably lead to persecution of those that don't agree with the state-enforced religion. Now, I want to start going over a special talking point that has become prominent among political conservatives. There has been a push on a few fronts to have Sunday be a day of rest for the nation. This push can be seen in Project 2025, much of which has been enacted by the current administration and some political commentators. Jonathan Berry, who authored part of Project 2025 that advocated for a national day of rest, was voted in as Solicitor of Labor, who is the head of the legal department within the Department of Labor. In Project 2025, it said that there will be exceptions for those who worship on another day of the week. However, he heavily implies otherwise in other sources. It is possible that society could spontaneously address this need for communal rest without state intervention, like it is possible that we could have traffic safety without mandates to drive on the right side of the road. Possible, but not plausible. The revival of blue laws, quote unquote, and other measures to guard the Sabbath is thus one more example of a prudent policy intervention to project the subjectivity, the personhood of workers. Another quote says, "Something I'd really encourage is it's hard to see a big federal role for this. It's really a question of state and local law. It is reinvigorating, where possible, Sabbath rest laws." So what Sabbath are we talking about here? It can't be the seventh-day Sabbath, which some Christian denominations as well as Jewish people keep, because the seventh-day Sabbath rest laws never happened in America. So it must be Sunday laws that he's referring to. So when Sunday laws have been an issue in American history, we should be looking for it to be an issue in the future as well, because those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. And a question that came to my mind is if God's law is good to follow, why shouldn't it be enforced? And this question has a couple of answers. Firstly, who is to say that those enforcing the law are interpreting it correctly? Or who is to say that those enforcing the law aren't at all corrupt or prone to using legal measures for their own gain? This has been seen again and again, so handing God's laws over to civil authorities seems a bit rash considering the historical consequences. Remember, Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." When we render unto Caesar's what is God's, that is when it starts to get dangerous. Even if they interpret it correctly, we shouldn't render to Caesar what is due to God, as Jesus said. Secondly, even God himself doesn't enforce his law onto anybody. The entire reason that humanity is in the mess that we're in is because God needed the universe to understand that his law is a law of love, and he is just to exercise his authority in regards to the law. However, he never immediately punished anybody for not wanting to follow his law. Satan had to have enough time to convince a third of all of the angels in heaven before God finally kicked him out. And even then, he didn't immediately destroy him. It took open rebellion, an outward manifestation of the inward sin, for God to expel Satan. When humanity sinned, Jesus came down and died himself rather than let us be lost. He could have punished us all and enforced his own law, but because he wants us to understand the reasoning behind his law and obey it out of love rather than fear, and experience the joy, peace, and freedom that comes with that, he allows each to make the decision for himself. In the end, the wicked will be destroyed, but rather than a result of enforcing his own viewpoint, it happens because his way is proven to be the correct way, and everything opposed to him degrades, hurts, and eventually dies. The wages of sin is death, which means that when we commit sin, the natural consequence is that we die. It's like if a person decided one day, I'm just going to live underwater for the rest of my life. They could hold their breath for about 3 minutes, or maybe get an hour or two with scuba gear, maybe even get days or weeks or months with a submarine. However, eventually they will die if left underwater because humans are simply not made to live underwater. God gives us the choice to remain underwater in sin if we want to, but if we choose that, then we will die as a natural result. All of this is to say that God does not even force his way onto his own creation. So what makes us, his creation, think that it's a good idea to force what we interpret as his way, whether it's his way or not, on fellow creations? So another question is, wouldn't a communal day of rest be a good thing? Why be against it if it is unaffiliated with religion? Well, first of all, a communal day of rest is always affiliated with religion. God commanded his creation to rest on the Sabbath, and whether you take that to still stand as the seventh day, which God ordained at creation and never changed, or you take it as Sunday, the concept of having a day of rest originally comes from God. Going a step further, God never changed the day from Saturday to Sunday. You will not find evidence of this in the Bible, which means that either you keep the fourth commandment or you don't. Either way, it has drastic religious indications and consequences. Now I want to take a look at what happens when those that are not affiliated with religion and are not converted Christians take a day off. In one study, it says, across 6 U.S. cities, this analysis of publicly available data demonstrates that gunshot events occur most often during nighttime, on holidays and weekends, and during summer months. The conclusion of another study says, whereas crimes against the person consistently reach their maximum frequency in the summer, such crimes do not always increase or decrease with the temperature, as is evidenced by the fact that criminal homicide is higher in December than in June and August. Crimes against the person are at a minimum in the winter months. Crimes against the property do not always reach a maximum in the winter and a minimum in the summer. This may be observed primarily in the case of larceny. There is a similarity between the time of greatest frequency of crimes against the person and the crimes against property. The time of day where the largest number of offenses take place is about 2 hours before midnight to midnight. Weekends have a greater crime frequency than midweek for all offenses. The day of greatest frequency is Saturday. Now, something that might have seemed contradictory at first is the first and second point. The first says that homicide is higher in December, and the second says that crimes against a person are at a minimum in the winter months. But I believe this is just a case of local maximum versus average. In December, homicide increases, but overall crime is the least in winter. In other words, it peaks, but it does not peak enough to make the winter months higher on average. Yet another article says this. Consistent with our hypothesis, findings from this large population-based study highlight a seasonal variation of homicide, an increase in homicide occurring on the weekend, on national holidays, and most strikingly on New Year's Day between 1996 and 2015. The majority of homicides at the weekend were committed by young males under the age of 25 years, people who had consumed alcohol, and people in paid employment. Victims at the weekend were also more likely to be unknown to the offender. So, the people that actually committed these crimes, these homicides, were mostly people in paid employment. In other words, it was during their time off that they committed these atrocities. And an individual speaking at a congressional hearing in 1888 about this very topic says, "For the state to compel men to do no work is to enforce idleness. Idleness is the root of unlimited evil. It is a true proverb that we learned in our boyhood. Satan always finds something for idle hands to do. In this world, to compel men to be idle is to force them into a line of influences and temptations, which, in the very nature of things, can only end in evil. It is well known, and it is one of the principal grounds of the complaints for those who are working for Sunday laws, that Sunday is, of all days of the week, the day of the most wickedness. That the record of crime and violence on Sunday exceeds that of any other day of the week, especially in large cities." So even back in the 1880s, people were talking about how crime rates increase when those who are not consecrated to God have idle time. So I would argue that enforcing a day of rest would, in actuality, be enforcing a day of idleness, which leads to more societal issues than if we didn't take time off at all. Now, I'm not arguing that a day of rest is worse for those who are consecrated in Christ. Those who are converted Christians would truly rest on the Sabbath, but there's a big difference between rest and idleness. And if we are not in Christ, then a day of rest can quickly turn into an idle day, which Satan loves to control. Finally, as for a biblical reference, Ezekiel 16:49 says that Sodom's sins were pride, gluttony, abundance of idleness, and greed, not helping the poor. And these led to her licentiousness, or as Ezekiel put it, to commit abomination before me. Even biblically, it is a bad thing to be idle. So enforcing a law onto people with unconverted hearts will no doubt cause societal chaos. Now, if the church is from God, why would combining it with the government be a bad thing? Don't we want the government to be less corrupt? Now, the issue with this question is that it assumes that the church will stay pure. And historically, this is never the case. When the church and state combine, rather than the church staying pure and the government becoming less corrupt, the opposite happens. This can even be seen on an individual level. Back when the Israelites were still a theocracy under God in the Old Testament, he forbade them from marrying unto other nations. And why did he do this? Because the women of the surrounding nations, being from a corrupt culture, would corrupt the men of Israel and lead them into idolatry. And what do we see when we look at history? Exactly that. Israel was led into idolatry again and again, and most of the time, if not every time, it was because they married into the nations surrounding them. While this is not a perfect example, because rather than the church and state being combined, it is Israel and the world, it still illustrates how corruption spreads. You cannot take something that is pure, join it with something corrupt, and expect the pure thing to stay pure. It is like combining pure water with salt water. Of course, the salt water will become diluted some, but overall, it is still salt water in the end. We've already seen what corrupt churches and religions do to others that disagree with them. And there are a plethora of historical examples, of which I mentioned 6 at the beginning. So then, if morality is from God, and keeping the commandments have to do with our fellow man is moral, then why shouldn't the government be able to enforce the rest of the commandments too? Why should it only be able to enforce the 5th through the 9th? To answer this, let me illustrate something. When a person steals something, they must have coveted somebody else's item beforehand. But the government does not punish them for coveting, they punish them for stealing. Or if somebody worships an idol, and because of this sacrifices a human, the government punishes them for murder, not idolatry. The issue with the question is that it assumes the government has the right to control our thoughts. There is a distinct difference between civility and morality. The government has every right and should enforce civility, because civility is how people actually act in the world. However, morality is not under the jurisdiction of the government, because morality is what people believe about the world. Think about it. The 1st through the 4th and the 10th commandment all have to do with our beliefs and thoughts. I would argue that it is extremely moral to believe in these commandments and keep them. However, the foundation of our country and constitution is in danger if I am able to enforce them. Why? Because the very freedom of speech is at stake. The 3rd commandment states that we shouldn't take God's name in vain. If the logic that all morality belongs to God and the government has the right to enforce morality applies, then people must be punished and imprisoned for their words according to the 3rd commandment. Or in other words, freedom of speech and freedom of conscience both cannot exist with this mindset. So now that I've gone over some of the frequent talking points in favor of the Sunday legislation, let me ask you a question about Sunday rest itself. If Jesus says render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, then is the Sabbath something to render to Caesar? Let's look at the Sabbath commandment itself. It says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you should do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. It distinctly says that the Sabbath is the Sabbath of the Lord. The New Testament also says that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, Matthew 12:8. Further, the command contains the seal of God. The seal of a king contains his name, title, and dominion. The commandment says his name, Lord, original Hebrew is Jehovah, his title, your God, or Elohim in the original Hebrew, and dominion. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Essentially, his dominion is everything. To take something that God made his seal and enforce humanity's interpretation of it onto the unconsecrated is not God's way nor his will. Making his seal a civil matter is degrading to God and goes against his law of love and liberty. And one last point I would like to make is that the Sabbath was never changed by God to Sunday from Saturday. In the Bible, the Sabbath as the seventh day of the week is mentioned 172 times, 59 times in the New Testament. When God in his holy scriptures deems this commandment important enough to put it in the Bible that many times, if he wants to change it, then I expect the new command to be emphasized as much as the old one. However, there's not a single time in the New Testament when Jesus says that the Sabbath is now the first day instead of the seventh. In fact, Jesus rests on the seventh day consistently throughout the Gospels, and his disciples rest on the seventh day after his death and resurrection. Therefore, Sunday worship must come from another source, and enforcing Sunday rest upon a population would be directly contradicting God's will. Now, even if the people were wanting to enforce rest on Saturday instead of Sunday, I would still be against it for all the reasons listed above. However, the fact that it is on a day which cannot be verified as the true Sabbath by the Bible means I am doubly against enforcing it. You may say, but the moral law was done away with, and therefore observance of the seventh day no longer applies. But I have problems with this position. No Christian will argue against the first commandment, which says to have no other gods before the one true God and Creator. Most will not argue against the second, which says to have no idols. No Christian will argue that we should be taking God's name in vain, breaking the third, and going through every single other commandment from the 5th through the 10th. Most, if not all, will not argue that breaking these are a good thing to do. So, which commandment exactly is done away with? The fourth is the one most Christians today do not keep. Even Jesus not only upheld these commandments, but deepened them and regarded hate against a brother as murder, and looking at a woman with lust as adultery. So if people only have a problem with one commandment, and Jesus upholds all of the commandments, including that one, then how can the moral law be done away with? Disregarding the evidence that suggests the moral law still applies, the statement that the seventh day is done away with because the moral law was nailed to the cross actually contradicts the Sunday rest movement. The movement wants morality to return to America, and therefore wants to enforce Sunday as a day of rest, and references the fourth commandment as evidence of why it is important. However, if that law was done away with, then it should not matter, and enforcing rest should not be an issue. But the reality is this. Galatians 3 says, "Is the law then against the promises of God? Certainly not. For if there had been a law given which could have given life, truly righteousness would be by the law. But the scripture has confined all under sin. The promise by faith in Jesus might be given to those who believe. But before faith came, we were kept under guard by the law, kept for the faith, which would afterward be revealed. Therefore the law was our tutor, and bringing us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor." People use this passage to argue that the moral law was done away with once Christ came, and was replaced by faith. However, this is not what the passage means. Looking at the first sentence, it says that the law is not against the promises of God. This implies that it works in harmony with them, and since the promises of God are the means by which we can be partakers of the divine nature in 2 Peter 1, and the promise by faith in Jesus is given to those who believe, then the law must not contradict the faith. If the law doesn't contradict the faith but works in harmony with it, then faith need not replace the law. And further, Jesus actually said, "For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle will pass away from the law till all is fulfilled." Matthew 5:18. So what does it mean when it says that we are no longer under a tutor, when that tutor is the law? The law is a tutor which leads to Christ, because the more we try to keep the law, the more we are aware that we can't keep it, and that our spirits are poor. The more we cannot keep it, the more we will mourn, because we realize our need for Christ. When we realize that we cannot do it ourselves and we need God, we will become meek, because we no longer will rely in pride on ourselves. Once that happens, we will hunger and thirst for righteousness, because Christ is the only one that can provide this. We will be merciful to others who do not understand this yet, and by Christ's righteousness we will become pure in heart. We will become peacemakers when we rely on Christ, the Prince of Peace. And because the world does not like peacemakers, we will be persecuted for righteousness' sake. This is the journey of the Christian. We are no longer under a tutor because we are under Christ, and his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Without the law, we would not understand our need. But once we understand our need, the law has done its job. It does not mean that the law doesn't apply, actually the opposite. But what it means is that the purpose of the law is not to make ourselves righteous, since that is impossible, but to point to the only one by which we may become righteous. And how is righteousness determined unless compared against a standard? And what is that standard? The law. So the law still applies, but we are no longer under the law as a tutor, because we no longer need a tutor to lead us to Christ once we have the faith of Jesus. A final proof of this point is that Jesus in Revelation says that his people are those that keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. It is by faith that we keep the commandments, not by the commandments that we have faith. But the commandments still will be kept by those who are followers of God. So, my point is this. The movement to combine church and state is growing. More and more voices are speaking on this issue, and in favor of religion being involved with politics. However, history has proven again and again that this is never good for the people. It infringes on fundamental human rights as well as brings about persecution, which includes imprisonment, torture, and death to those that disagree. The argument that I'm making is not because I disagree with God's law. In fact, I am very much for it. But when a human being decides that it is right to enforce the aspects of his law that deal with the mind, it is contrary to the principles God himself set up. Jesus said to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Another way to put this is that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The love due to God should not go to man, and a man should not and cannot force others to love God. Our society is pushing for this enforcement, but we can stand with God and fight for freedom of conscience. Psalm 27 says, I would have lost heart unless I had believed that I could see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. If you would like to see any of the references that I have for any of the quotes that I said, I'm going to put them in the description. And yeah, I hope that you got something good out of this video, and I hope to see you in heaven someday.